Good evening and welcome to Fish Hawk Live and the Great Lakes Fishing Podcast. Thanks so much for everybody for joining us. And tonight we're joined by Captain Travis White from Kenowa Charters in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Travis, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Great to be here.
Travis, before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself. We had a chance to talk in the green room before the show started. You've got a really, really cool background, but give us the nickel tour about what you are, who you're about, and a little bit about your charter service as well.
Yeah, sure. So I'm located up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Closest town or city center is Houghton Hancock. So this is called the Keweenaw Peninsula for those that may have heard of it. We're further north and west of Marquette, Michigan. And, I came up here to school in 2007, studying engineering at Michigan Tech. I fell in love with this area, just the close proximity to Lake Superior. We're surrounded by it, being on a peninsula. And then also just the rugged landscape up here is really cool, really unique, a lot of interesting history with the mining and everything that happened up here at one point in the forest industry. When I graduated from Tech, I had the opportunity to take a job right here in the area. And prior to that, I'd started doing a little bit of guiding as sort of a summer fun job over in Sault Ste. Marie on the St. Mary's River, which is where I grew up. That was a lot of fly fishing, a lot of light tackle for Atlantic salmon, steelhead, smallmouth bass. Once I got up here, being surrounded by Lake Superior, my interest turned to the big water. And we've got a really diverse fishery up here. On Lake Superior, it's similar but very different to Lakes Ontario here on Michigan. We've got salmon, we've got kings, pinks, coho, but we've also got a lot of lake trout, and that's the big native fish up here. State record was 61.5 pounds. So right out of college, I bought a bigger boat for navigating the type of water up here. And I set my eyes on maybe one day catching a state record lake trout. So I'm in constant pursuit of that, I guess you could say. But I'm still working as a mechanical engineer in the marine engineering field at Michigan Tech University, so part-time. I also co-founded ProNav Marine. So we've got a small company up here, and we make GPS controllers for electric trolling motors that basically give them all of the iPilot type of functionalities as sort of a retrofit option. So they go onto the basic trolling motors that come on a lot of your smaller 16 to 18 foot boats right off the lot without all the bells and whistles. And then in addition, in the summer season, I keep really busy doing nearshore and offshore fishing charters around the Keweenaw Peninsula. We've got great nearshore fishing all summer. It starts out really early in the season where fish are shallow, and we actually even get to do a little bit of light tackle casting and such, and we talk more about that. And then throughout the summer, we do a lot of trolling, just similar to what you guys probably do down there. And then also offshore fishing at places like Stannard Rock, which folks are probably familiar with, and Isle Royale, which is a really cool destination trip that we can talk a little bit more about. So my passion is being on the water, and I've tried to put together a career, a little bit of a piecemeal with all these different things that gets me out there as much as possible.
That's very cool. You're based in this area. I want to get into some of those other things later, but you're based in this area that's kind of the heart of what a lot of people consider just an epic fishing destination. It's a different fishery than what you find on Lake Ontario or Lake Michigan, something like that. But what we're talking about tonight is two areas that really have extremely low pressure. It's not a place you're going to go out and have to fight crowds. Let's talk about Stannard Rock first. The lighthouse there was built in the late 1800s to protect shipping from Stannard Rock Reef, which is a really kind of this cool underwater mountain. The water slopes up. I guess there's areas there where it's only about 4 feet deep. I think I read somewhere the average depth is about 16 feet. Tell us a little bit about that reef and what people might encounter there.
Sure. Yeah, Stannard Rock's a really cool place. I first had the chance to fish there probably the summer I graduated college. Went out with another charter captain up here, and that was my first experience with it. The thing that stood out to me is that Stannard Rock is a place where there's perfect habitat and structure for lake trout. That fishery is almost strictly a lake trout fishery, although we do catch a few, stray coho and steelhead there at times. But it's this underwater mountain. It's about 5 miles long. It's about a mile at its widest point. And right close to that lighthouse, there's a spot where there's actually a rock that sticks out of the surface of the lake. So it was a real significant hazard to navigation. It's pretty well in a straight line north of Marquette, straight line east of Copper Harbor. And if you line up the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula with sort of the mouth of Whitefish Bay, it's right in that right in that transect. So the guy that found it and mapped it out was Charles Stannard, and it's how it got its name. But what's unique there is we've got these beautiful lake trout. It's in Lake Superior, there's a lot of substrains or variations to the lake trout. They're all lake trout, but there's these particular ones we call red fins, which are very dark bodied, very colorful fins. They have these giant bright red fins on them. And one of the unique things about them is that they school up on the structure out there, these underwater rocks and sea mounds. And they also can grow quite large. Part of that is due to the low fishing pressure and kind of the low commercial utilization historically of this reef. So there's a population of trout out there that is relatively intact. It wasn't as affected by the commercial fishing and the sea lamprey invasion and all these other things that wiped out a lot of lake trout in Lake Superior historically. It's got a population that has a lot of good small fish, a lot of good medium-sized fish, and then some very, very large lake trout. And we're talking lake trout that easily go 30 pounds or larger. You're not always going to catch fish like that out there, but it's actually quite common to go out there and to have an interaction with those fish. And maybe that's the other thing that's so unique about that reef is that how we fish there is typically going to be jigging and casting because the fish are concentrated in certain little spots. If you're going along, you're marking the structure and you're marking fish, you can stop your boat and jig right under the boat or cast around the boat. And one of the cool things with that clear water out there is you might be in 100 feet of water, but if you're casting a lure out, letting it sink and reeling it back to the boat, there's a really good chance you're going to see lake trout chasing your lure to the boat. And sometimes those trout are huge.
Yeah, that's I've never had a chance to get out there and do that trip before, but I've watched it on Fishing 411, and that's one of the things that you guys encountered that day that they filmed the show out there. It was calm seas that day, and they were looking down at the bottom in about 35 feet of water and basically sight fishing these lake trout, and that looked like a whole lot of fun doing that out there.
Yeah, it's really neat. It's kind of like a big aquarium out there, really. There's places like you described that are really shallow, 15 to 30 feet, where you can see fish and you can cast for them and you can catch them on light tackle with a small spoon or a blade bait or a jig. I mean, they're not extremely picky. They're either on or they're off, and there's kind of not a lot of middle ground there. But then there's also deeper water around the edges of the reef. So what I found makes a good lake trout spot in Lake Superior is typically that reef structure that comes up to about really shallow or 50 to 100 foot, and it's surrounded by very deep water, dropping off to over 500-600 feet on all sides of it. There's a good population of burbot, herring, various types of forage fish, and most of those are larger forage fish. So these big trout have plenty to eat. And so we often fish in that 50 to 100 foot range, throughout the summer, really a function of water temperature more than anything. We find those fish and you get on them and you just work for them.
Travis, you talked about that 61 pounder. That's the Michigan state record lake trout caught in 1997 out there. But you're saying that the size structure out there, like you said, there's some smaller ones, but some big fish as well while you're out there fishing.
Yeah, it's in my experience, there's a lot of good sized trout out there. You don't experience lake trout of that caliber near shore where you've got a lot more fishing pressure and boat traffic, commercial fishing, ice fishing, all sorts of fishing within a few miles of shore. I think that population of trout, this is my theory, is that they're somewhat, home bodies to that reef. They're somewhat, fish that live there most of their lives, I suspect, or fish that, end up there and stick around. You see fish out there that you don't see very often near shore. If we caught 100 lake trout within 5 miles of the Keweenaw, you might have a fish over 20 pounds, but you're not going to consistently encounter that type of fish. Whereas if you caught 100 trout at Stannard Rock, you're very likely going to have a trout over 20 pounds or maybe even over 30 pounds if you're lucky.
And that's because it's hard to get out there. It's 25 miles to the nearest shore. It's actually the furthest lighthouse from shore in North America, I believe. I've been saying United States, but I think it's in North America. What's the challenge? What's it like to get out there? Tell us a little bit about that process.
Yeah, well, you're right. That is what makes that fishery so great and so unique, is that it's a place where the trout are relatively undisturbed most of their lives, most of the year. From the Keweenaw Peninsula here, we've got a run out of either Copper Harbor or Lac La Belle, about 13 miles. That's from the Irons to the lighthouse. So that's all over open water with no shoreline protection, once you leave the Irons. So you've really got to, be a student of the forecast, understand how barometric pressure affects waves and, conditions, understand how wind direction factors into getting there and back safely, or at least having an enjoyable boat ride. I sure don't enjoy a long bumpy boat ride. So we try to plan these trips on days where we've got good stable weather, for a good, 2-3 day window, and often try to run for the middle of that window. And, more often than not, with a little bit of planning, you'll have a great trip out there, no problems. And on those nice days, you are going to see other boats out there. They come from Marquette, Shelter Bay, over by Munising, Big Bay, which is west of Marquette, and then the Keweenaw, of course. So there's quite a few different ports where folks can access it. For reference, Marquette is about a 50-mile run, but Big Bay is somewhere around 32 miles. So that's a popular put in for the 20-foot walleye and a typical Great Lakes boats that you're seeing people fishing trout and salmon in. It's just, really, you plan ahead. You got to trust your electronics, have backups of everything. There's always fog and different things that you have to contend with. You want to have your VHF radio, just basic safety equipment. I also have started carrying a Garmin InReach. It's a relatively inexpensive device that lets you text people over satellite, and also pull up a marine forecast, a point forecast, and get sort of the hour by hour while you're out there where you have no cell service. There's no hope of reaching someone on your phone out there. So that's kind of one of the nice things about it, but also one of the challenges of it.
Yeah, that's a place that, a lot of guys that are used to fishing near shore, if they run into weather, you can move and kind of get out of it and get yourself slip in somewhere if you need to. But you go out there's nowhere to slip into. You really got to not just know what the weather's like as you're going out, but know what it's going to be like as you're coming in. Have you ever, and I'm sure the answer is going to be yes here, but seen or heard people kind of get themselves in trouble making this run?
Yeah, that definitely happens. That some people still don't look at the forecast and they just see a nice morning and go for it. I wouldn't advise that. I look at the National Weather Service, weather.gov. They've got a great tool where you can go and select a point forecast on the map. That means you can click on the lat long at the Stannard Rock Lighthouse, and you can get an hour by hour weather graph showing you the wind, speed, and direction, the forecasted wave height based on that, rain, thunder, that type of stuff. So that's ultimately what it requires. But there's people that end up getting into trouble or mishaps. It's great to buddy up. If someone's planning a trip out there first time or 100th time, it's always a great idea to try to buddy up with another boat if you can. And oftentimes that maybe it's not possible, but it's just, if possible, it really makes a lot of sense. I was out there one time and it was just my boat, and there was one other boat that came out of the Keweenaw, out of Copper Harbor, and there was a couple older gentlemen in that boat. And halfway through the day, they motored up to us, and they've got like a 17 or 18 foot, wraparound windshield with maybe a 90 or a 115 outboard on it, no backup motor, no trolling motor. And they motored up to us, and it was starting to get a little foggy. And they asked, which way is Copper Harbor? And that's where they came from. So, that was a little interesting. It's like some people, you wonder how they find their way out there and back. But again, redundancy is the key. If you've got a chart plotter in your boat, have the Navionics app on your phone, and that's a great backup. It's one anyone can buy for a few dollars subscription.
Yeah, that was my first question: is how do they get themselves out there? They couldn't figure out how to get back. You'd think it'd be more difficult to find the place than to find your way home. But,
right.
We've got a question coming in here from Kevin Skalicki, and he wants to know how often do you end up rescheduling trips out of Stannard Rock due to weather?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So, the way my schedule fills up in the summer, right now I'm pretty well through August. I've got a few days here and there. When we book a Stannard Rock trip, we plan on a full day of fishing. If the weather's good, we go to Stannard Rock. If that offshore forecast doesn't look good, or it's not reasonable to make that boat ride out there, then we've got great nearshore fishing around the Keweenaw for all sorts of trout and salmon, and that's just the plan B. I know it's not what everyone wants to do. If they're really psyched up for going out to Stannard Rock, the plan B of nearshore fishing is, it's maybe a disappointment, but it's a lot better than beating yourself up for a bad boat ride. But, folks that are really serious about getting out there, a lot of times I've got, clients that have booked 2 or 3 days of fishing. We book 2 or 3 full days. And if we get any opportunities to go to Stannard during that time, we go for it. And maybe that's even a couple of days of fishing out there. But if not, then we're doing a bit of nearshore fishing, which fortunately we have good nearshore. So it makes a good backup plan, if nothing else.
How about we've been talking about jigging out there? Do you do a lot of trolling in that area?
The first couple of seasons I started fishing out there, I did a fair bit of trolling, and part of that for me was just a very effective way to cover the reef, learn the structure, mark fish, mark waypoints, and kind of get a lay of the land. And at this point now, where I've got a good program for going out there and getting on fish right away, I would never even consider bringing trolling equipment in the boat. I just find it so much fun going out with just some light jigging rods, or even heavier rods, depending on what type of bait we're fishing with. But, trolling is very effective. And on the tough days, which there are plenty of out there, where those trout are somewhat lockjaw, part of that is we're always running out on these nice, bright, sunny, calm days. So it's typically not your ideal fishing weather, perhaps. But trolling gear can certainly save the day on those cases, or it's also a great way for folks to kind of learn that reef and start to mark waypoints where there's fish. Because what we found out there is that if you find a piece of structure that has fish on it one day, that piece of structure is going to always have fish on it. It may not be every day, but that's a waypoint you want to save, and that's a place you want to go back and look the next time you're there, because more likely than not, there's going to be fish on the same spots every time you go there.
The structure on the structure, if you will.
That's it, yeah. And some of these spots, when I say a spot out there, I'm referring to about 100-foot diameter in some cases. That might be a 100-foot rock pile that comes up, and when you're 100 feet off of that, you're in 250 feet of water. So very key spots, and that's finding those is kind of part of the puzzle out there, and it takes a lot of time, really. But with the electronics that folks have nowadays, it really cuts that curve down, and it makes it easy to go out there and possibly have that chance of your first time being an awesome trip. But I've found that it's taken many years to really get to a point of consistently having those awesome days, and it's just it's a lot of work, but that's the work that pays off, and gets you those types of experiences of trophy lake trout fishing.
All right, here's a question coming in from Chase Palisari, and he wants to know if you find it more effective to be on a drift jig or a vertical jig when you're targeting those lakers.
Yeah, we do a little bit of both. That's definitely a depends answer. Obviously, you're at a big advantage if you've got a bow mount trolling motor with spot lock on it. When you find fish and they're on a very small piece of structure, being able to park and hold on that structure and fish those fish is really important, especially if you've got a good current, which there is a fair bit of current out there, or a good wind. That those fish might be in a 100-foot diameter area, and drifting over them can be very effective some days if your drift is slow. But if it's a fast drift, it just doesn't give you a lot of time on that spot on the spot. Now, there are circumstances where drift fishing can really pay off, and that's on the days where maybe you're finding fish are really scattered, or your spot on the spots just aren't panning out. There's fish there, but they're not feeding, they're not eating. Sometimes, when that's the case, when the bite is tough at 100-foot, or the bite's really tough at 50-foot, we tend to go out deeper to maybe 200-foot. And once you kind of hit the bottom of that reef where it starts to drop off into those types of depths, then the structure is a little less spot on the spot, and it's more of drifting in that situation. So when we're out in deeper water there, we drift a little bit more and try to just cover some of the larger area at the base of the reef, and that can be pretty effective.
All right, let's talk about what you're using. What type of tackle are you using to do this jigging for these monster lake trout? What's your gear look like?
Yeah, well, I have basically 2 sets of rods that I kind of go to out there. One set of rod is sort of a medium heavy spinning, somewhere in that 6.6 to 7.6 range. I'm spooling up, your 3,500 size spinning reels, fairly large capacity, just to give you some depth and also retrieve rate. And we're fishing primarily braid on these setups, so 20-pound braid is more than enough most of the time to get the job done. And then we're typically running about a 20-pound fluorocarbon leader, terminated to anywhere from a 1 to 2 ounce lure. That could be a jig in plastic, that could be a bucktail with cut bait, that could be a blade bait or tube jigs. There's a pretty wide variety of tackle we use on the end. A lot of it, in my experience, a lot of times if the fish are there, they're going to hit a white tube jig just as good as they're going to hit a silver blade bait if they're feeding. Some days you might find a little difference, but I kind of have the standard box of stuff that I use, and it kind of keeps reducing. Casting spoons are really effective. We like to take a half to 1.5 ounce spoons, cast them a long ways from the boat, let them sink to the bottom, and then reel them back into the boat. And you'll find fish that are maybe towards the bottom or even suspended a little bit, chasing those right up to the surface and hitting them as they get closer. So that's the lighter spinning tackle, and that works great in the shallower depths. That works great when you're catching more of the 5 to 10 to 15 pound trout. But one thing I've kind of evolved to over the years is going to a little bit heavier gear, in particular for fishing some of the really, if I'm really selectively trying to catch trophy lake trout, I'm gearing up with stuff that most guys would say is, musky gear, something like a 8 to 9 foot, heavy, extra heavy bait caster setup. So, most folks would think of that as pike and musky fishing gear. I also have some heavy spinning rods that are sort of I think they're an inshore series. So something that you'd use for like tarpon, big snook, big redfish, that type of equipment. The reason we're using that heavier gear more and more is because we're fishing some larger profile baits, such as 9-inch paddle tails or, 10 to 12-inch tube jigs, bondy baits, things of that nature. So you've got a lot of weight on the end of your rod. So when we're running these heavier setups, we're using more like 50-pound braid terminated to 40 or 50-pound mono or fluoro. I don't think that leader at the end, the mono or fluoro, is super critical, but I guess why not do it? It definitely doesn't hurt anything. And then, on those heavier setups, that gives us a lot more line capacity for jigging out into 250, some of that deeper water. And one more factor that I think is really important that a lot of people wouldn't think of this, or, it's not the first thing you think of, is that if you're selectively trying to catch a 30-pound lake trout, for one, those fish are going to fight hard, so you need good tackle to whoop it. But for two, these are really old fish. They're not really fish that we want to keep and take out of the system. A 30-pound lake trout is at a minimum 30 years old. And that's backed up by DNR studies on Lake Superior looking at growth rates. So at a minimum, you're talking fish that are several decades old, but potentially up to 50 plus years old. So these aren't fish we want to take home and eat. These are fish we want to handle carefully once we get them up. So we want to fight them pretty quickly, just like anything. You want to handle that fish, tire it out, get it to the boat, keep it wet as best you can, and then get it back down there.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you next, Travis. I think most of our audience does most of their fishing by trolling, and that's how they're going to be catching these fish. What's it like to catch a 30-pound lake trout while jigging? What is that like compared to the trolling deal?
Yeah, well, it's a good old classic rodeo. It's if you hook a big lake trout jigging, not everyone fights the same, but some of these fish, or most of these fish, their number one instinct is just to stay on the bottom. So if you're in 100 feet of water and you hook a fish, 100 feet down, and it's a 30-pounder, that fish is going to take a while to get even up off the bottom. And typically as you're fighting them, you're going to get them halfway up, and they're going to make these big, powerful runs right back down to the bottom. And it's so much fun when your boat is stationary and you're able to, play that fish out. Sometimes you're running the rod around the front of the boat or around the motors, chasing that fish around. I can't imagine a trolling scenario where you're consistently going to land those fish without a whole bunch of stuff tangling up on you. I do a lot of trolling. Anytime we get into a real big trout, around the Keweenaw here, a lot of times you got to slow down, take some stuff out, and make room for that fish. They tend to dive down under the boat and work a kind of a tight circle coming up. And they sure can pull. There's fish that you can barely lift them, for many, many minutes into that fight. Until they're really starting to, gas out a little bit.
Let's talk about the seasonality, Travis. When is kind of the time to go? If you want to do this Stannard rock trip, when is kind of the best time to make your way out there?
Yeah, well, I think the real prime time out there is July and August. We typically will start the season out there in May or June, but the water's super cold. The fish are pretty lethargic, and there's a lot of tough days out there early in the season. Surface temperatures up until mid-June are going to be, below 45. So it takes a while for those fish to really get hungry and turned on. Early in the season, May and early June, there's a lot more times where you're going to need to go out deeper and fish deeper water to try to find those fish. I'm talking deeper being like 150 to 250 feet, whereas July and August, we typically do most of our fishing in 50 to 150 feet. And I would say on average, a lot of that 70 or 80. So that's relatively shallow for lake trout. And I think they're a lot more active and aggressive, as summer goes on. And, they also fight a lot better, and you don't have to be dropping jigs into the abyss, looking for them. So I think July and August are great. The one thing you want to watch out for is as it gets later into the summer, we start to get a lot more wind, sort of that seasonal shift from summer to autumn, which happens up here mid to late August. So we get a lot more blow days mid-August and on. And the last couple of years, there were very few days in September and practically zero in October where you could even want to take a boat out there.
Before we move on, Travis, is there anything about Stannard Rock, that fishing trip, that I didn't ask you about that you wanted to talk about tonight?
I think, I guess the one thing that I like to help educate people on is just the conservation aspects of that fishery. I personally believe that it's getting fish more now than it ever has. And I think that can be backed up with creel surveys and such, but it's easier to plan the trip with the good forecasting. People have better electronics and better boats. So you are going to see more fishing pressure out there now than in the past. And I think everybody going out there has a pretty good attitude, but we want to share that with our fellow anglers who might be new to it. It's really important to think about how awesome that fishery is and how it compares to, what you might have near shore. And I think the reason it's like that is because, the lack of pressure and the fact that many people going out there are catching and releasing a lot of the fish they're catching, especially the big ones. But, I also say it takes a lot of 5 and 10 pound lake trout to get, a 1 or 2 20 to 30 pound lake trout. And that's a couple decades away. So taking a 20 or 30 pound fish out of that system, it's not, it's up to everybody's own discretion if that's something they want to do. But, it takes 30 plus years to put that fish back there. So, and it, also the sort of the smaller medium fish. So I think that's just an important aspect. And, I think most anglers are really good about that and realizing that fishery is what it is because those fish have had that isolation to get to those sizes and population densities.
Yeah, that actually goes into a question again from Chase. Once again, he says, do you think that there should be some sort of slot limit and destination places like that?
Yeah, I think everyone's got different answers to this, and it's not an easy question to answer because I understand people like to eat fish, and that's not a bad thing at all. But this is a special place. Most people aren't making a 50-mile boat ride to go catch dinner. That would be kind of crazy. So if it was just me, and that was like if I was managing that fishery, realizing the value that fishery has to the Great Lakes and the sport fishing community, and also the economic impact to all the little towns around here where people launch their boats to go out there. If it were me, I'd almost look to maybe consider that as a catch and release only fishery. And part of that also ties into the hooking mortality studies that have been coming out in recent years. Whereas the water gets warm in the summer months, some of those fish that we're releasing may not be making it. Fortunately, Stannard Rock, being so far offshore, has the coolest water temperatures in the lake at that midsummer time. So I think that's less of an issue out there. But I also feel that, just what hooking mortality there might be in catch and release fishing could potentially be enough of a factor to make justification to not even keep that many fish out there. Maybe it's just a few, maybe it's a slot limit, maybe it's a reduced number. I'm not sure what the best answer is, but I would sure love to see the sport fishing community get together and maybe collaborate and brainstorm on what would make the most sense to make sure that fishery is just as good or even better in 10 or 20 years as it is now.
Yeah, it's been fun talking about Stannard Rock. We're 30 minutes in, and I think we could talk about this for an hour, but we came up with some other topics. We're going to talk some Isle Royale right now, and that brings us a question here from Nick. He says, Isle Royale or Stannard, if you could only go to one, which one is it?
Well, a few years ago, I probably would have said Stannard because I was really focused on just catching the biggest lake trout I could. But between Isle Royale and Stannard, we've caught similar caliber of fish, and the more I've learned about Isle Royale, the more I've seen the potential for huge fish out there. Isle Royale is way more of an adventure. It's sort of boat fishing, camping. There's different species of fish. There's sort of near-shore inland pike that grow well into the mid 40-inch range. There's brook trout, and then of course there's tons of lake trout, and also salmon, steelhead, and other critters all summer. So I would probably rather spend a weekend at Isle Royale than Stannard at this point, just from those, from that angle.
Yeah, I don't think you'd want to spend a weekend at Stannard. I've seen a few YouTube videos of guys going in there, and I know that you're not allowed to do it, but I've seen some videos, and I don't think anybody would really want to hang out there for the weekend.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's a long day trip, and that's where the island is a little more relaxed. You go out there for 4 or 5 days and set up camp, and you can spend some time at the campsite cooking dinner. You can eat steaks. You're not packing light if you're going out there in a boat, and then you can also go out and enjoy some incredible fishing. I will say, like in terms of just sheer numbers of fish, I think in a day of fishing, once you've got the lay of the land at Isle Royale, you can catch probably far more numbers of fish than you will at Stannard Rock. The average size of the fish we catch at Isle Royale is maybe a little better than the average fish at Stannard Rock, but I would still say the biggest fish, the top percentile fish at Stannard, is probably bigger than the top percentile fish we've ran into at Isle Royale.
It's a pretty good run out there. Tell us about the trip from your neck of the woods out to Isle Royale.
Yeah, well, there's basically two options. So option one is if your boat is 20 foot or under, you can actually transport it on the National Park Service ferry out of Houghton, Michigan. And I would really recommend that if you got a 20 foot or under boat. You can put your boat on the deck of this Park Service boat. It's like $160 round trip. It's very affordable, considering the cost of gas and everything to get out there. They'll drop your boat off in the water. So they put it on slings, take it off your trailer, and then drop it in the water at Isle Royale. And once you're there, you can just, go crazy. You can explore and experience the island. If your boat's over 20 foot, you're going to need to run out there from mainland. We can do that out of the Houghton Hancock area, or we can do that up by Eagle Harbor and Copper Harbor, which is actually about the closest point to point in Michigan, from Eagle Harbor to Rock Harbor, which is about a 50-mile boat ride, all across open water, across shipping lanes, through the fog, with absolutely no islands or anything else to stop and take shelter. So that is definitely the wildest part of the lake, and that crossing is one that is probably the scariest one to make. Going there is never that concerning because you leave when you've got a great forecast, and it's usually nice and calm. And in those conditions, it takes about an hour and a half to get there, running 30 miles an hour, thereabouts. Coming back, though, if you've been there for 4 or 5 days and you don't have an updated forecast, the forecast on the marine radio is nothing compared to what you can get when you get a point forecast on the computer. So coming back is a little more of looking at the sky and winging it. And I've had some pretty crazy rides back, and not very pleasant conditions. So that's something to think about. I have definitely mitigated some of those rides back in the rough stuff by getting that Garmin inReach, so I can text somebody on shore, get them to text me back the point forecast or the details, or a thumbs up. And that just gives me a little bit more peace of mind from a planning the trip back standpoint. But you can never go to Isle Royale when you're in a hurry. If you plan to leave on Monday and get back on Sunday, you're never going to hit those target dates. You've got to be flexible, and you can't force it. The weather is the boss.
Yeah, that sounds like could be a potentially hairy situation. So to put that kind of risk on the line, what are the benefits? Why go on a trip like this? What's kind of the draw on something like this?
Yeah, well, for me, the draw is just the isolation of it, which is also the risk factor. But it is probably one of the only places in the Great Lakes where you can take your boat and fish for days and potentially not even see another boat, potentially not even see another person, depending on where you're staying at on the island. I really enjoy that experience. It's just a wilderness experience. The mainland has great, hiking trails, wildlife. There's moose and otters and all sorts of critters. So it's just really a cool boat fishing, camping experience. I equate it a lot to going up to Canada on a DIY sort of bush trip, and it really is that type of experience. The nice thing is that the National Park Service operates the island. That wilderness area is preserved in the way it was hundreds or thousands of years ago. And they also have these docks spread all around the island with these rustic campsites, which typically are the rustic campsites typically include like a three-sided, hard-sided shelter with a bug screen across the front and a hard floor. So you can just bring sleeping pads or sleeping bags, roll them out in there, claim your spot, set up your cook stove, and then you've got that nice dock to come and go from and go fishing. So it's just an awesome experience. It's set up really well for boaters, and the fishing out there is really hard to beat. I think Isle Royale's fishing and the dynamics of the whole ecosystem out there are very unique. There's tons of forage fish, tons of there's fish everywhere out there. It's just unbelievable. And I think that's almost a little slice of what Lake Superior might have been like, pre-human. It's just it's hard to even describe. It's very unique.
What do the trolling scenarios look like out there? What are you trolling for, and what kind of setups are you running out there?
Yeah, well, the water out there is also very cold because it's so far out into the lake. Early in the season, lasting right past 4th of July, the surface temperatures are going to be no more than the low 50s, near shore, even within some of the big channels and harbors. And then offshore, we were out there the first week of June, and the temperatures offshore were still around 39 Fahrenheit. So basically, when you're going earlier in the season, all of your fish are going to be stacked up, in relatively shallow water or up by the surface. You might be in a few hundred feet of water, but you're going to find trout and salmon and steelhead right in that surface film where that water is warm and there's insects and stuff blowing offshore. For trolling, it's absolutely awesome. There's a lot of structure. You don't have to get far from the island to experience really good trolling opportunities. If you're out there in a real small boat, there's fantastic trolling just in the little protected harbors and the fingers and such, where you can literally fling a rapala out behind the boat 100 feet and drag it and catch a 20-pound lake trout. That happens out there probably every day. But if you're more into the technical trolling with lead core and boards, that's a phenomenal way to navigate around the island and find fish at any time of the year. And then, of course, divers and downriggers in that program, they work great. But I will say there's probably more downriggers in the bottom of the lake out around Isle Royale than anywhere else in the Great Lakes. There's rocks and snags out there that come up out of nowhere, and you just got to be real careful if you're fishing close to the bottom.
So that keeps our friends here at Fish Hawk in business. We'd love to sell some extra probes to those guys.
Absolutely. So, and I think that's a great thing. Like out there, it's a really diverse fishing opportunities. There's so many different types of lake trout that have evolved out there with different preferences for shallow water or deep water or suspended in the middle. If a guy likes to jig, you can go out to that deeper water and jig. If a guy likes to cast, you can fish the shallow, rocky shorelines and pitch, husky jerks and rapalas and small jigs and spoons, and you can catch these beautiful lake trout right along the shoreline just about any time of the summer until, really the point where you're going to have to go deeper is when the water surface temps are, 60-ish. And that only lasts for maybe a month out there, probably, mid-August to mid-September.
When you're trolling in that area, what do you got tied on at the end of your line?
We run a lot of spoons. We run combos of, flashers and spoons. We run Dodgers and spin and glows, but that, you don't need the Dodger spin and glow there, and you're definitely not going to be dragging your downriggers in the sandy bottom because there is none of that out there. So spoons are great. It's super simple. You can do the flasher fly thing. There are some king salmon out there that show up right about the beginning of July, typically, and the reason they come out there, there's still some Chinook stocking up on the Ontario side of the lake, which is only maybe 20 miles as a crow flies to Canada. So we're actually pretty close to the mouth of that Nipigon Bay system. And I believe that's where a lot of those kings are coming from. And Isle Royale has just an unbelievable herring forage base. So I think, anyone that fishes kings is going to have a unique opportunity to catch Lake Superior kings, which are really hard to find. I know there's guys that do it, but I give a lot of compliments to those guys when they catch them because they're hard to track down in this big lake where there's not a lot of kings. But then steelhead is the other cool thing. You can catch those all summer around the island, and they're going to be really close to the surface. So, bright, flashy colors, pinks and orange and purple, stick baits, jointed rapalas, spoons. Those are hard to go wrong with. You really don't need much more than that.
Is there anything about fishing Isle Royale that you wanted to talk about? I want to get into ProNav Marine here in a second, but is there something you wanted to touch on here tonight that I didn't ask you about?
Yeah, I'll just maybe touch a little bit on the logistics. So if you want to plan this trip out, first step would be to call the National Park Service headquarters, their office here in Houghton, Michigan. Let them know that you're a boater, you're planning a trip. There's just a little bit of paperwork and whatnot you got to do with them to register your boat. So make sure you're doing everything on the up and up. That will help you out because they do enforce it out there. So start there. They'll give you all the guides and regulations. There are some minor differences out there compared to the rest of Lake Superior, but it's not that hard to navigate. And then other than that, plan enough time to give yourself an opportunity to experience it. I wouldn't go out there if you only had 2 or 3 days. I'd really encourage folks to look at planning that trip for, 4 to 7 days at least. I'd love to spend a month out there, but that's just never possible.
And again, they're no cell service as well. So if you're planning on posting to Facebook while you're out there, that's not going to happen.
It's a no Facebook zone, which is all right with me. It's a cool place.
All right, let's talk about ProNav Marine. It's a company that you've co-founded. It's a GPS-guided autopilot system. It connects to your bow mount troller. And like you said a little bit earlier in the show, this is for the guys that didn't buy, the real high-end one at the beginning of their boat adventure. This is a retrofit deal. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, well, that's the gist of it. We started this company about 7 or 8 years ago now with the intention of giving another option out there to folks that are looking to upgrade their trolling motors. If anyone's been in the market in the last few years, you know how hard it is even just to find a trolling motor, especially if you're looking at the bigger motors with the spot lock and the link systems built into them. Our product is a little black box, literally about that big, with a couple extra wires that taps into your foot pedal controlled motor. So it works on all the Minn Power Drive series of trolling motors, which is probably the most popular Minn ever made. That particular series of motors typically does not have iPilot, so therefore we've got a very large part of the market that either your options are to go buy a new motor with all the bells and whistles, or you can retrofit it with ProNav. You clamp our unit on, plug it in just like your foot pedal, and what it lets you do, it gives you a handheld controller where you can steer the motor. You can hit an anchor button to hold your boat in a spot. You can mark waypoints, and we also have a mobile app interface that allows you to do mapping. So using our app, you can use satellite imagery and Navionics lake maps to program routes along a certain depth. Or, if you're casting shorelines, you can use the satellite imagery to lay out a series of points, and you can hit go. When you get on the water, you can pull up that saved route and hit go. and your trolling motor will follow that shoreline route at whatever speed you set, and you're literally fishing hands-free. So some of the folks listening probably know of all these benefits already, but for the folks that are looking to upgrade, if you have one of these power drive types of motors, it's an option to get that functionality without buying a new motor. So our price point starts around $700, whereas the closest new trolling motor with these types of features is well into the probably upper $1,500 to $2,000 price range.
Tell us a little bit, like you said earlier, you are an engineer. You do the fishing thing because you love it, but you're an engineer by trade, and you're doing some research with Michigan Tech University. Tell us a little bit about what you've got going on right now. We talked a little bit about it in the green room before we started, and I thought it was super interesting. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm really fortunate to be able to have a very fun engineering job at the university at Michigan Tech, which is located in Houghton, Michigan, right on the Portage Canal, which is a waterway that dumps out to Lake Superior on both ends. So I went to Michigan Tech, studied mechanical engineering, and the year after I graduated, they built this beautiful facility called the Great Lakes Research Center. I'm employed at the Great Lakes Research Center, and all the projects I work on as an engineer are somehow or another related to the marine environment. Primarily the Great Lakes, but the types of projects ranges from biological sciences and fisheries research to advanced robotics and autonomy. So one of the projects I'm working on right now pertains to marine autonomy. We're actually developing a remotely operated vehicle. It's basically a jet ski type of platform that will be fully autonomous, kind of like your Google car. You brought that example up earlier when we were talking. And it basically can drive itself, so I can sit at a computer screen, program it with a mission, and it can go out and complete that mission. And the reason it makes sense to have an unmanned vehicle like this is for applications that are dull, dangerous, or dirty, where it doesn't make sense to have a human on that thing. One application that we're working toward is surveying, which is basically mapping of the lake bottom. And over the next 10 years, there's a really big push here in the Great Lakes to map the bottoms of the Great Lakes and all the shallow and deep water areas to a pretty high resolution, which not even close to there today. But there's a lot of agencies and groups interested in mapping the Great Lakes for the benefit of commercial and recreational users. So fishermen love maps. I love maps. This autonomous vehicle will be doing a lot of surveying work where it can just go back and forth, mowing the lawn, we call it, creating these detailed points with the sonar, measuring the water depth and logging the GPS position to create those maps. So that's one of the applications I think the fishermen are going to like. And then one of the other things that we do at the research center is we build and deploy the marine weather buoys that a lot of Great Lakes fishermen are familiar with. We've got close to a half dozen buoys out here already in Lake Superior. These buoys basically measure real-time wind speed and direction, wave height, and water temperature at the surface. And also some of them have temperature strings hanging below them that give you the subsurface profile. So, it's a great way to calibrate your fish hawk. We've got one out here where we fish, and you can see that temp string, every 10 feet down from surface to 100 feet. And it's just a phenomenal resource. You can go look at that on a web page or on your smartphone, and gives you some of that information of what the lake's doing.
That's super interesting, the stuff that you're doing, Travis. Really appreciate you coming on and giving your time tonight. It was really fun to talk to you about some of these things that don't get covered very often. I think a lot of people are still kind of just seeing this stuff and being introduced to it. So we appreciate you. Is there something that you wanted to talk about tonight that I didn't ask you about?
Well, no, thanks, Chris, for having me on. This has been a real pleasure. I've known you guys for a while here, and was looking forward to this opportunity, when we first started talking about it. So, I really enjoyed listening to the podcast, and, I encourage any of your listeners who have questions to feel free to reach out and contact me. I've got a website. It's KeewanaCharters.com. This is a busy season, so please be patient if I don't get back to you right away with questions and such. I do answer every email. It just might not be immediately. So I'm open to that. I love to answer questions and help fishermen out. And I will say the Keweenaw is an awesome area if you're looking for a any season really getaway, with your family or just with your fishing buddies. There's a lot of things to do up here, as far as getting yourself set up in a nice Airbnb and being close to the lake. There's a lot of opportunity. So this area is really conducive to bringing the family and also towing the boat.
Travis, thanks again so much for coming on the show. Chase Palisari, you got the Fish Hawk swag bag coming to you today. So go ahead and send us a private message with your shipping information. We'll get that out to you. But Travis, we appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your summer, the rest of your season out there.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and to everyone listening, having a great season.